Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome to KADIT School of Comparative History of Religions, third section on creation, myths, and religions with Professor Carole Cusack. Before we begin, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to Professor. Thank you, Professor, for being with us today. And I want to say something on KADIT and its upcoming programs. KADIT is an independent research school, focuses on mainly the history of religions and related disciplines, and organizes weekly programs. And we have a 16 weeks syllabus, and we organize our programs accordingly. And anyone wants to participate in our programs may find the QR code in our Twitter page and can participate in the programs. And I'm not the moderator in this program, so I give the moderation my friend Anas. Thank you again, Professor. It is a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for me, Professor, for joining us today, for accepting our invitation. It is really great to have us with you here today. I would like to give a little bit information about your profile, if you wouldn't mind. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Carole M. Cusack graduated from University of Sydney with a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies in 1986. Her PhD, an examination of the process of conversion among the Germanic peoples in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, was published as Conversion among the Germanic peoples in 1998. She has published Invented Religions in 2010, published by Ashgate, and The Sacred Tree in 2011, published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing. This Sacred Tree work is especially great. I would highly recommend to those who haven't read it yet. Yeah. Her main area is antique and early medieval era European religions, conversion to Christianity process, and the religious traditions that resumed during all this conversion and all these eras. Yeah, I don't want to keep you waiting anymore, and we can start with your representation. I hope.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for your kind invitation, and I hope that what I have prepared today will be useful to the researchers who are taking part in this class. What I'm going to do now is begin sharing my screen. Unfortunately, you have disabled screen sharing for me. So can you enable it so that I can?
Yeah, it is enabled, I suppose.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. What I want to make sure now is that everyone can see the screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, that's terrific. Thank you very much.
Yes.
What I've been asked to talk about today is myths of creation, myths that are at the very beginning of the story of the world and the story of human beings. And these are found in almost all parts of human culture and different societies and civilizations. There are some, interestingly, that aren't very interested in creation, like the idea of where everything began. And I would say, for example, that Chinese mythology and certainly the indigenous Aboriginal dreaming stories of my own country are not especially concerned with the absolute beginning. But it's worth pointing out that they are concerned with how the world got to be the way that it is and why people operate in it in certain ways. And so where they don't go to the beginning, they nevertheless talk about how the landscape is shaped or how powerful gods or ancestors encounter living human beings. And so I think we can say that there is a general kind of interest in the same themes of creation. But of course, there are an enormous number of different cultures in the world. And in a short lecture, it's necessary to narrow down and only consider a few of those cultures. And perhaps, even though some people would argue that this is not a good strategy, I think that in a lecture such as this, concentrating on dominant models is permissible. We cannot always look at the exceptional cases, which have very distinct differences. And the dominant models, I think, well, in our world, monotheism, the belief in one God, is certainly the most powerful and most prominent kind of religious belief that gets talked about. So the first thing I want to say is that creation myths have two general foci, and both of these are exceptionally meaningful to human beings. Creation myths deal with the creation of the world. I could say the universe, but I've given you a picture only there of our own home planet, the Earth. And of course, it is the place, the world that we live in. And so it is without doubt the most important place that is created when discussions of worlds are concerned. The other thing that we are obsessed with, I think this is fair to say, is that human beings want to know the origins of ourselves, why we exist, how we came to exist. And of course, when you look at those two themes, you can see why mythology is a good way, perhaps, to approach this topic, because obviously we need to talk a little bit about what mythology is. And if we look at the word myth, it comes from a Greek word, mythos, and all it means is story. It doesn't imply incredibly important religious story or scientifically true story or systematically philosophical story. It's just a story. And so what's interesting is that mythology of the world connected to religion is a kind of special category of story. It's a repository of beliefs about the world where stories have become more significant or given greater power than other kinds of stories. But it's also really useful to understand that different communities, different societies elevated different kinds of stories to prominence and dominance. And one of the things that is going to be a focus of my lecture today, the difference between religious groups which have many gods, which are polytheistic, and religious groups which have only one god, which are monotheistic. That difference between the types of god or gods that a society venerates, that makes a huge difference to what sort of stories get told as well, because human beings have different kinds of relationships in cultures where there are multiple gods, and they can sometimes even marry people who are gods or have some particular kind of close friendship with people who are gods. Whereas in monotheistic societies, human beings really only have one role, and that is that they are God's creatures. God has created them, and so they have to live in accordance with the will, the justice, the law, the ethics, the desire of that one God. So we come up with different kinds of stories as myths. I think that's very important. So I'm going to start with Indo-European mythology, and I'm not going to talk about it very much at all. I think I've got 3 or maybe 4 slides. We're going to talk mostly today about the Bible and its relationship to Mesopotamian mythology. But I thought the Indo-European idea might be interesting because it's so completely and utterly different. These slides can be circulated to anyone later on. I'm not going to read them out, and some of it looks pretty obscure. But what I'm going to suggest is that that story that I said that people want, the story of the planet and the story of the people, in Indo-European mythology, Bruce Lincoln, who is one of the great Indo-European scholars of our contemporary era, has pointed out that there is a story about how the world gets created. It's totally different to the biblical one. It's a story about a priest who's usually called some version of the word for man or individual, and another figure who's often called twin because they seem to be kind of very similar. Some stories they are in fact actually twins, actually brothers. The Indo-European myth of creation is that the twin, the second person, is sacrificed by the priest. Now, priestly sacrifice is something that we're familiar with from a lot of different religions. And in this case, what happens is that the twin is a primordial being, someone who exists at the beginning. And one of the interesting things about primordial beings who exist at the beginning is that they're not like normal people. So from the body of a single man, the entire world can be made. And we'll look at a couple of different texts that talk about how that happens in different Indo-European cultures. Just in case people don't know what Indo-European mythology is, you probably know that the languages of the world group into different families. The Indo-European languages are a very large family that include most of the European languages. That's why the word European's in the title, but they also include the Sanskrit-related languages of India, the language of contemporary Iran, ancient Persia, and also quite a few dead languages, including one that was even spoken in China, Tocharian. So that's the way the world gets created. The world gets created by sacrifice, and sacrifice of a being who is so fertile, so generative, so profoundly filled with potentiality that you can make a whole world out of him. The interesting thing is the Indo-Europeans also do have different myths about how human beings get created. I haven't mentioned that on this particular slide. In this case, Lincoln is talking about the myth of humanity, which is about a hero slaying a dragon. And it probably doesn't surprise you to know that just about every culture has a hero slaying a dragon kind of myth. And what that is a exemplary myth about men and masculinity, and how men should be brave and also defenders of the community and able to meet even the most terrifying adversaries with courage, moving always forward. And I think that's a fascinating sort of orientation, I suppose, for people to have. But let's go back to this idea about the world being made from a being. A lot of people, when I tell them that in first year religious studies at the University of Sydney say they've never heard of it. They think everybody always thought that the world looked like a sphere. And sometimes they say, oh, except, you know, weren't there some people in the past who thought the world was flat? And sometimes if the students have done ancient history, they'll even point out that Plato thought that originally human beings were like spheres, also round, perfect forms, and that what happened to them, the kind of story of how humanity got to the miserable condition that it's in nowadays, for Plato was that they got split apart and these beautiful, perfect spheres broke. Okay, what I've got here on this particular slide is a piece of a hymn. It's a hymn. This is a hymn. It was written probably around about 1000 BC, maybe a little bit more recently. It was written in Sanskrit. It's known from an ancient Indian mythological book called the Rig Veda, which is a collection of hymns. All the hymns speak about different gods and about different things that happen in the universe. This hymn is called the Purusha Sukta. The word Purusha means man or being, and that kind of tells us instantly that he's one of these primordial people. And when you realize that the hymn is about him getting sacrificed so that the world can be made, you realize that, yes, he is a being who stands at the beginning of time. In this particular hymn, there's not just one priest who conducts the sacrifice. All of the Indian gods come together and they sacrifice Purusha because they want to build the world. And so the hymn says, when they divided Purusha, how many pieces did they prepare? What was his mouth? What are his arms, thighs, and feet called? And this is really interesting because as well as his body making up the whole universe, also social structures and orders come out of him. So it says next, the priest was his mouth, the warrior was made from his arms, his thighs were the commoners, and the servants were born from his feet. And we see there a hierarchical society, and we see that obviously the priest is the mouth, the authoritative word comes from it. Warriors fight with their arms. It all makes complete sense. But then it says that they make the world too. The moon was born from his mind, of his eye came the sun. From his mouth, Indra, one of the gods, sets forth fire. From his breath, the winds come about. From his navel, there was the atmosphere. From his head, the heavens. From his feet, the earth. And from his ears, the four directions of the compass. And so we have a slaughter, a sacrifice at the beginning of the world of a single being, and it creates not just the whole world on which human beings live, with the sun and the moon and the stars and everything, but it also creates the social order that human beings have to obey. The priests at the top, then the warriors and the farmers and yeomen, and then the servants at the bottom. So this is an interesting idea. Actually, I've covered almost all of this slide, so we won't worry about it too much. The idea of the creation being both about the world and about human beings is the really key kind of idea. The interesting thing is, this kind of story is found in lots of different Indo-European mythologies. And I've just included Scandinavia. I've got 2 slides more, and then we're going to go to the Bible, because the Scandinavians also have a really interesting kind of matching myth about how humans are made. So the same idea applies in Viking mythology, and it's a lot more recent than, of course, the ancient Indian mythology that I've just been speaking about. The Viking Age is kind of like 800 to 1000 of the Common Era. And so it's, almost 2000 years after the Rig Veda was written, but it has a story about how three gods, the high god Odin and his two brothers, attack and kill the primordial giant whose name is Ymir. And he's the first being ever to exist, which gives you that idea. He's one of those primordial beings that you can make a whole world out of. And so what happens is that they do exactly that. When they kill him, so much blood flows from his wounds that it drowned all the frost giants, who are the enemies of the god, except one who escapes. They take the body of the giant and they take him into the middle of the huge gap in the atmosphere. And out of him, they make the earth. Out of his blood, they make sea and lakes. The earth was made of his flesh and the rocks of the bones. Stone and scree they made out of his teeth and his molars and of bones that had been broken. And then it says at the bottom, they took his skull and made out of it the sky and set it up over the earth with 4 points. So we get the 4 directions again, which are also mentioned in the Rig Veda. And under each corner of his skull, they put a dwarf to hold up the sky, which is a rather nice image. And the names of the dwarves are Austri, Vestri, Nordri, and Sudri. And I always say to my first year students, you don't get any points for guessing what that means. It means, of course, east, west, north, and south, which are the names of the dwarves that hold up the sky. And then it says they take molten particles and sparks that were flying around and set them in the middle of the firmament of the sky to illuminate the heavens and the earth. And so you get the sun and the moon and the stars. My last Scandinavian slide, my last Indo-European slide, is about trees. And it's partly because I have written on trees, as you were told at the beginning, and I'm very interested in them. I find them important and significant for human life and also as symbols of different valuable elements. So in the Scandinavian mythology, how do humans get created? I've pointed out that in the Indian Purusha Sukta, humans get created at the same time the world gets created, and there isn't a separate procedure, so to speak. But in Scandinavia, there is a separate story. It's only a little story. The same 3 gods, Odin, the high god, and his 2 brothers are walking on the beach on the very edge of the world. And this is a very interesting idea too, the idea that there's a lot of potential where the land meets the sea. And what they find is they find some small trees growing almost at the seashore. And they look at the trees and think they look like the shapes of the gods themselves walking. And the fascinating thing is there's a kind of link with the Bible there, because in the New Testament, the Christian section of the Bible, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verse 24, has a blind man whom Jesus heals. He gives him back his sight. And when he looks around and reveals that he can see, he says, I can see people. They look like trees to me, but they're walking around. So it's the same kind of idea. The Scandinavian gods see the trees and they think that the trees look a bit like them. And what they do is they look at the trees in terms of what they are. One is an ash tree, one is an elder tree, and then they animate and bring those trees to life so they become the first ever human beings, if you like, the Adam and Eve of Scandinavian mythology. So trees get in there. Humans get created from trees. It's a rather beautiful concept, I think. But when we think about how creation works for monotheism, it looks different, because if we look at the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, there's an idea that creation comes out of nothing. God is already there. That's okay. In polytheistic ideas, the gods are already there too. But God doesn't need trees or rocks or sacrifices or materials to build a world or to create people. In monotheism, the one God is supremely powerful, and creation, therefore, can happen through God's own personal power without any kind of raw material. So in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God hovered over the waters. God does the same sorts of things that we see in polytheistic mythology. He creates light. The light is separated from the darkness, and so you get day and night. You get the way of measuring time. God separates the waters on the earth, the seas and lakes and rivers, from the waters above the firmament or the vault of the sky. And that is the same kind of idea, actually, that the sky is some kind of roof over the earth, and that there's water somewhere up above it, and it can come down as rain, as flooding even. And then dry land is formed by gathering all the waters together. So we have a world. The world is empty. God fills it initially with vegetation and with animals. There are two different stories about how human beings are created in the Bible. One is in Genesis 1, one is in Genesis 2. Genesis 1 just says God creates human beings in his own image. And he says, in the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. He blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and rule it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature. And that gives humans dominance over the world. Now, I have to say, from a sociological point of view, obviously, human beings, when they're looking at origin stories for themselves, want an origin story that will place them at a point that makes them more important than animals or plants, for example, a point that makes them the most important creature on earth and in a special relationship with God who creates them. This is true in all mythologies, though actually more so in monotheism, because the idea that the human being in some sense reflects the identity of God, has some quality of likeness or similarity with God, makes them ultimately special and superior. So I think that is a really important thing to keep in mind. The second account is in Genesis 2, and the difference there is when Adam needs a helper, God makes him go to sleep, and the figure of Eve, the woman who is created to be his special companion, his appropriate other half, is actually built from one of his ribs, which perhaps we might say looks a little bit unusual and maybe different. I'll tidy up these slides. I can see there's an error in this page before I let you have them finally. So, okay, I've made a suggestion that the sort of story that you find in something like the Bible is quite different to the sort of story that you find in polytheistic mythology. And some people will say, well, don't you think that that is partly because you're giving the Bible like special status and treating it in some ways as different to mythological texts that come from other places? There is that. But it's important, I think, to make clear the way in which the academic study of religion is related to the kinds of studies for example, that faith communities make and do. So faith communities engage in theology. They investigate topics like the nature of God, the way that God works in the world, the morality and ethics that God demands humans live by, and lots of other issues of belief and also of conduct, religious practice, things that people have to do in the world. And these concern communities of believers. But the academic study of religion looks at mythology, religion, and theology as kind of human activities. And it's interested to interpret them generally in non-supernatural ways to try to figure out what they mean from a human standpoint. And so you can attack myth from all sorts of perspectives. You can study it from the point of view of linguistics and compare languages with common situations. You can study them from social and political perspectives. The most important thing about all of this is that it puts the study of mythology in a framework of what we could loosely call anthropology, not so much the way that it's understood in like an academic university nowadays as being somebody going out to study some remote tribe in Africa or Asia, but more in the literal sense of the word from the Greek anthropology, which is a science or a study of human beings and how human beings operate. Important things about human beings can be learned from studying myth and the way that myths make meanings of human worlds. I think that's important. So when we think about whether we're treating something like the Bible in a different way, I think we have to argue that the text of the Bible promoting the idea of a single God is like a development beyond polytheism. And in the Bible, God creates out of nothing, out of sheer power, and sets an absolute standard of truth, morality, and conduct for people to follow. So every being in the universe is created by God and is inferior to God and responsible to God for what they do. But of course, when we look at the Bible, we find, I suppose, what you might call a buried mythology, because the idea of one God seems to have developed later than the idea of multiple gods. And when we look at Mesopotamia, we find that there are a lot of mythological links and connections with the text of the Bible. So, for example, if we look at the Mesopotamian creation myth, a text called the Enuma Elish, this is a set of words that mean when on high. It's a text that's named from the first word, 2 words on the actual clay tablet. That's what that rather bad picture is of. It's little clay tablets that have the text of the Enuma Elish on it. Now, this was a very popular creation myth. It was very well known. It's preserved in multiple languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian. It means people really liked it. It made a lot of sense to them. And this particular picture shows 7 tablets that actually have the little creation story on it. It's also a creation story that was linked probably to New Year rituals and to ideas about the renewal of human society as well as the renewal of the world. I haven't really got time to go into that, but it is significant. It's important. When the Enuma Elish was performed with rituals attaching, it was at the new year, and it was to make everything go back to the beginning, begin afresh and anew. So this particular tablet, which is one of the 7 from the other page, tells about the hero god Marduk, who is the protector god of the city of Babylon, and he defeats the water goddess Tiamat who is the primeval chaos, and he brings order to the world out of defeating her. This tablet's from Nineveh, which is in Iraq, modern Iraq now, and it's from the 7th century BC. It's currently in the British Museum in London. So we have a story that's like a heroic epic. There's two gods of the waters, Apsu, who's male, and Tiamat, who's female. They're married, they have loads of children, but the children are very noisy and very, very, very disturbing. And eventually Apsu petitions Tiamat to restrain them. Their ways have become grievous to me. By day I cannot rest, by night I cannot sleep. I shall abolish their ways. You know, she's horrified when she hears that her husband wants to kill her children. And so she throws him out, and he goes to plot with the other gods about what to do. Another water god, Ea or Enki, who's associated with the atmosphere, the heavens, rather than the seas on earth, arranges the conception and the birth of the hero god Marduk. Tiamat gets a lover, a guy called Kingu, and he becomes the general of her forces. And then they go to war. Tiamat's forces led by Kingu, and the gods' forces led by Marduk. And he defeats her and kills her very brutally. Now, a lot of people will say, what's that got to do with the Bible? And that's a very good point. It's actually interesting that the Hebrew word tehom, which appears in the first chapter of Genesis, is in fact the same as the name of Tiamat, and the primordial waters in the Genesis account are referred to by her name, which suggests that the people who wrote Genesis knew that story, even if they wanted to change it into something that reflected only the activity of the monotheist God. So we have various connections. I've got a few slides here, 3 or 4 to go, and we'll be finished in about 7 minutes, I think. This is a picture of the Entemenanki ziggurat, which is a temple structure dedicated to the god Marduk in his city, Babylon, from the 6th century BC. And Babylon is one of the most important kind of connections. Babylon comes in the Bible, the Christian New Testament as well as the Old Testament, to be understood to be a site of the enemies of the monotheistic God. And this is because, of course, it is a city of pagans, of polytheists, that is very, very, very powerful at the same time as the ancient Israelites are organizing their country and their culture. And so they can feel the influence of these pagan Babylonian people. And of course, they are taken captive by the Babylonians as well. And many, many Israelites spend hundreds of years in captivity in Babylon. So Babylon is like the enemy, and they're very aware of Babylon. They know about it. It might interest you to know that Alexander the Great actually demolished the Entemenanki ziggurat in 323 BC. He was very fond of himself and didn't really like the idea of anything being more grand than him. Okay. Other connections between Mesopotamia and the Bible include the great epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I'm not going to be able to talk about very much, but I mentioned earlier that in polytheism, humans can have interesting relationships with gods. Well, Gilgamesh is a half god. He's got one human parent and one divine parent. And consequently, he kind of sits between the gods and the human world, and he's special. But he's also arrogant, and the gods send him a special friend, a man called Enkidu, who is a kind of bridge between beasts and humans. So Gilgamesh bridges gods and humans, Enkidu bridges beasts and humans, and when they become friends, they kind of unite the best qualities of humans and the best qualities of animals. But then they go wild, as young men do, and they offend Humbaba, the god who, the spirit who looks after the cedar forests of Lebanon. Ishtar, the goddess, propositions Gilgamesh, and he tells her to go away, that he doesn't like her. And then what happens is that Gilgamesh kills the bull of heaven, which is a sort of divine beast, and the gods just don't know what to do. And they say, well, he's got to be punished. And they decide that it would be better to punish him by killing his friend than by killing him, because then he'll be lonely and he'll be hurt. And so Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh goes on a quest to become immortal. And this is where the big connection with the Bible comes, because he meets a man who's called Utnapishtim, and he has survived the great flood by building a ship, which he was able to put his family and different creatures onto. And he tells Gilgamesh that it is possible to become immortal. There's this special plant. Gilgamesh finds the plant, and then he doesn't eat it quickly enough, and a bird snatches it away. And in the end, a woman who makes wine, who's called Siduri, tells him to stop looking to be immortal. Humans should just eat and drink and be merry, because it's inevitable that they're going to die. So the obvious parallel there is that Utnapishtim is like Noah in the Bible. He survives the great flood. The last thing that I'm going to talk about as a connection, my second last slide, is that sometimes there are descriptions in the Bible that resemble texts from elsewhere. So this two set of passages that I've got on this particular slide, one is a description of the Assyrian king Sargon, and the other is a description of the Israelite hero Moses, who is the savior of the Israelites, who leads them under the instruction of God, obviously, out of slavery in Egypt and into the promised land, the Holy Land, which is Canaan. So what it's all about here is the idea of the baby who has a special destiny, who is being threatened, and his mother makes a decision to put him in a little basket and place him on a river. In the case of Moses, it's the Nile in Egypt, but the account of Sargon, which people probably don't know as well, says, Sargon, strong king, king of Agade am I. My mother was a priestess, my father I do not know. My paternal kin inhabit the mountain region. My city of birth lies on the banks of the Euphrates. In secret, my mother bore me. She placed me in a reed basket, and with bitumen, she corked it so that it wouldn't, sink. The river carried him along, and it's the Euphrates River, one of the two great rivers of Mesopotamia, the other one being the Tigris. And when he's discovered, he's taken from the water by a water drawer who makes him the water drawer's adopted son. In the story of Moses, it's an Egyptian princess who finds the baby Moses in his basket floating on the Nile, and she adopts him too. We might say that there are motifs that turn up in many, many different stories. Does it necessarily mean that there are historical connections? Biblical studies scholars believe that in these cases there are. Okay, I've reached my final slide, and what we see here is a really great image of Assyrian religion, and we can see the sun symbol in the middle. The sun is tremendously important in nearly all ancient mythologies because it's what makes the plants grow, and it gives people light. In a world where you didn't have artificial light and you didn't have artificial heat, the sun was probably more important than it is for us nowadays. So I've thought about the issue of why should we study myth and religion? Does it help in any sort of way, or is it merely something that's just kind of interesting? Well, I think it is interesting, obviously. I've done a lot of this, but I also think that if we think about creation myths, we get ideas about the motivations of human beings to know their place in the universe and to know how they originate. And I think if we look at science nowadays, we can see that ideas that the world begins in a big bang, for example, is a kind of creation myth. And similarly, ideas about Darwinian evolution are a sort of creation myth of human beings. If we look at the mythical beliefs and stories that lay the groundwork for monotheism in the Bible in particular, we see that there are links with Mesopotamian texts and with other kinds of ways of viewing the world, most noticeably polytheism. It's worth pointing out, I didn't have a chance to do this, but there's also quite a lot of connections between texts in the Bible and ancient Egypt. The most famous probably is the text called the Hymn of the Aten, which was written by the pharaoh Akhenaten, which has a lot of linguistic parallels to one of the Psalms, Psalm 104. The Psalms are kind of body of hymns. In the Bible, they're credited to King David, though it's not likely that they were actually all written by him. So I think when we look at the study of myth, we see the context of the emergence of monotheism, the way that people got to understand the idea of the one God. Polytheistic gods need tools and they need raw materials to make worlds and people, but the one God makes everything from nothing and stands outside the creation as he's the holiest and the most powerful being in the world and immeasurably greater than humans. And we have to say that when we think about that, that's a way of positioning humans in the world as well. Yes, humans think they're important. They think they're the major and the most significant being, but there's also a sense in our lives that we are small somehow, that the universe dwarfs us. And certainly monotheism's emphasis on the power and the absolute and utter superiority of God is a way of keeping humans in their place, you might say. Thank you very much. I have come to the end of my presentation and I'm going to stop screen sharing now.
Thank you, Professor. We can proceed with questions now, if you'd like.
Thank you.
Okay, I can start with your permission. I would like to ask about the polytheistic creation myths. You know, all you've mentioned once was the gods created, they used raw materials, and their materials were always something alive, right? You know, for example, it was a giant, or it was a man, a priest, or it was an ox, that sort of thing. Is there any myth that they used something not alive, you know, something,
You
know,
mean like a stone?
Yeah, stone, like this. Or,
no, not that I know of. And I think that's a really fascinating and important thing that you have drawn attention to here. You can only create from living matter in most of the polytheistic systems. I mean, people know the difference between stones, for example, and trees. Stones are thought to be not alive, where trees are alive. And I do not know of any creation myth where, say, a stone was the source of the world. Sometimes the world is created from a cosmic egg. But again, you know, an egg, people understand, an egg is going to grow into a bird and hatch into another being. It's alive, not inert like stone.
you know, it seems to me it's emphasizing the living nature of Earth, you know, kind of Gaia theme. You know, it's not.
That's also really interesting. You could argue that, yes, there's a kind of idea that the world was made from a living being and the world is a living being. In fact, there's a amazing, very early ancient Greek text by a guy called Pherecydes of Syros, which is called something very mysterious. I think the 7 recesses, but it's the story of the marriage of Zeus, the god Zeus, to the earth. And the marriage present that he gives her is a cloak that has all the planets and stars and everything embroidered on it. And so when she's like seen as a woman, a human-shaped person, but when she puts the cloak on, she becomes the earth. So the earth is a woman, but it's also an orb that we live on, a planet. It's a beautiful image.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I have quite similar, but it's not at the same time. When we look at the Mesopotamian culture, we see that anything is associated with actually the daily life. I mean, the god Marduk defeated Tiamat, and that's how the creation began. And Babylonian culture, Akkadian culture, everything is actually holy. And how these cultures associated creation myths also with their daily lives. I wonder, this is the similar part. I wonder if there is any creation myth which any live thing, material or human or primordial creation, goddess, giant-like creatures, not associated in the process.
Well, the point was made that sometimes the primordial creature is an ox. That is very common. A cattle, not just oxes, but oxen certainly. And I think that is really interesting because that's a daily life thing, because usually the culture that has the ox as part of the creation is a herding culture with pastoralism, where wealth is your cattle, and the whole of life is really about looking after cattle. And we can see that moving into a completely different kind of place. The Maasai in Africa, who are a cattle herding people, all of their myths are about cattle. And it shouldn't surprise you because it's the whole of life for them. I'm not sure if that's completely an answer, but I think there's always the primordial creature in creation can be a god or someone remote from human beings, or it can be an ox, which is close to human beings, but it's always not an ordinary ox. It's got to be a special ox that you can sacrifice in order to create a world.
It might be non-logical because we talk about creation. So there must be a creation. So yeah.
I see another hand.
Yeah.
Oh, Professor, first I'd like to express my appreciation for your participation and contribution.
Thank you.
You mentioned about the oneness of the God in the Bible. By the way, I'm an MA student of Arabic philology and still linguistic undergraduate. So excuse my lack of knowledge about these topics. What I want to ask is, how can we cohere this denotation, the oneness of God in the Bible, with the Trinity doctrine?
Well, this is interesting because I didn't actually really talk much about Christianity. I stuck with texts in the Bible that are really about Judaism, because it's the Old Testament, which we in religious studies, we don't call the Old Testament because that's what Christians call it. It's the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. And so the Christian theology, which creates this Trinitarian understanding of God, is immensely complicated And it is paradoxical. And when I teach on monotheism to undergraduates, I always say that you can put Judaism and Islam together much more easily. There is so much more of an affinity in the way that these two religions operate, and in the closeness of many of their concepts, and even the language, because of course Hebrew and Arabic very, very closely related. And what normally is kind of given as an explanation for the way that Christianity went off in a completely other direction is that it had Judaism as its like original context, but moving into the Greco-Roman world, it became completely entangled with Neoplatonic philosophy, and a whole lot of concepts which were utterly alien to the Jewish worldview became absorbed into Christianity. And of course, the whole thing about the Trinity, a lot of people point out that there are sort of mentions of it in the New Testament, but when you encounter it in, say, the works of late antique theologians, it's been elaborately developed much beyond the indications that are in the New Testament. And often a lot of Christian doctrines took 300 or 400 years to even get like agreement on. And I mean, you could argue actually that the Trinity never gained 100% agreement, because the Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East disagreed about certain aspects of the relationship between God, the Father, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. And there were a whole lot of other groups of Christians, most of whom died out because they were persecuted by all of the mainstream ones, who just didn't accept it at all and couldn't see how it worked, and used to think of Jesus more as like a sort of special messenger or emissary of God. So I think it's a subject I cannot really offer a great deal on, except to say that obviously it took hundreds of years and it involves a lot of concepts largely from Greek philosophy.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very useful. Also, I have a question about your published work, Secretary, but it may be excessive for this lecture. I can mail it to you if you want.
Thank you so much. That would be lovely. If you write to me, I will answer.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. Have a good day.
Thank you. I think there's another hand.
Yeah, Emre, you can ask.
Hello, Professor. I
Hi.
want to ask something. I want to know what you think about the effect of pagan folk religions in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and Scandinavia on Genesis creation myth. Maybe ancient Greece, ancient Rome, or Scandinavian folk religions.
It's not actually possible that any of them could have had influence on the Genesis myth, because the Genesis texts were written long before the Scandinavians, for example, and long before intimate contact between the Israelites and the Greeks, which only begins around about the Seleucid era, which is after the death of Alexander the Great.
Yes.
So there's no direct influence. So if we were to look at classical Greek or Roman mythology, we would see that it had some things in common, maybe, with the Mesopotamian and Egyptian context. But certainly, if we're thinking about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the strongest influences or parallels are found in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and also in what we know about Canaanite mythology itself, which is not perhaps as much but we do have some texts like the Rashamra text, for example, which explain what the religion of Canaan was like before the Israelites arrived and established monotheism.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions? You can raise a hand or. I suppose no. Okay.
One of my friends asked from the chat, and he
Yeah, about the directions.
Yeah.
At the moment, I can't actually think about one that would be, but it's not surprising because this is a really, if I looked, I'm sure I could find something. And the reason I say this is because, again, it's all about how a human stands on land. And ancient cultures had 4 directions, just as we do, obviously north, south, east, west, but they also had kind of directions that were around their own body, like what is directly in front of you, what is behind you. There was this kind of sense of where you're located. And there are definitely directions mentioned in nearly every Indo-European mythology. I would be very surprised if they were not also present in Mesopotamia, though there is one thing that makes it maybe slightly different, and you can have the same feeling when you look at ancient Egyptian mythology. One of the things that Mesopotamia and Egypt have in common is the idea that where you are, it doesn't matter where you are at the center of the world. So if you look at ancient Egyptian mythology, it changes depending on whether you live in Memphis or you live in Luxor or you live in Cairo. You know, there are these different theologies focused on different gods. And we have the same thing in Mesopotamia. There are different theologies placed, you know, where Marduk is the supreme deity in Babylon, but he's not in other Mesopotamian cities. So the city has the sense of being the center. And so you probably find that each place defines the cardinal directions differently, depending on where it is actually located. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any questions, comments? No, no questions, no comments.
My cat is trying to make me feed her.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation again, Professor.
Well, thank you. I will correct the couple of textual errors in the slides and send them to you, okay?
Okay.
If anyone wants them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. It was a great presentation and program.